To implement the feature, I'm going to start with a route definition. So inside of app.js, let's add a third when. I'll tell the routing engine when it sees something like repo slash parameter username slash parameter repository name, then please do the following. I want you to load a template, repo.html, and I want you to load a controller in charge of that template, the repo controller. Now you could start this off by implementing the view first or the repository controller first. I'm going to start off with the controller. So create a new file, repo-controller.js. I will need to include this script in index.html. Otherwise, the controller will not be defined. So please include the script, repo-controller.js. That can appear anywhere in this list as long as it is after app.js. And inside of repo controller, I'll follow the pattern of creating an IFI, then going out and getting a reference to my GitHub viewer. And ultimately what I need to do is tell that module that I'm registering a new controller. It's the repo controller, and that will be a function that I'm about to define, repo controller. So repo controller is a function that will need scope so it can do data binding. It will need route params so it can figure out what username and repo name we're searching for. And it will need the GitHub service. Let's figure out what we're searching for first. The repo name will come from route params.repo name. The username will come from route params.username. Remember, we need both of those pieces of information to get the details of a repository. And these names, repo name and username, they just need to match the way you've described the parameters to the routing engine. Username, repo name, all lowercase. Then we can go up to the GitHub service and say, GitHub, please get the repo details for username and repo name. Now, this is a method that is not defined on the GitHub service as yet. We're going to need to define it, but we can assume that when that comes back, it will give us information about a repository. So I can say .then, here's a function that will get some data, or let's build named methods instead. I've gotten the repository, or I've gotten an error. Now, there's really two ways to implement get repo details. Since getting all the information that we need about the repository and its collaborators requires two HTTP calls, you can certainly take the approach that we took in user controller, which is first, get the user information, and then get the repository information. So I'm making both calls by calling something on the GitHub service and kicking off those calls from the controller itself. For the repo controller, I'd like to show you a slightly different approach, which is I'm going to make one method call, and that service is going to put together all the information I need so that I don't have to make a second call to the GitHub service from my controller. All I need is on repo and on air, and then we will go over and implement what we need in the GitHub service. So on repo is a function that will take some data, and I'll just say scope.repo equals that incoming data. On error is a function that takes some sort of reason that that error occurred, and then we'll just say scope.error equals the reason for the error, and that's all we need in our repo controller. But this will require us to work a little bit harder inside of our GitHub service. So I need to expose a method, getRepo details. That's going to be a function that takes a username and a repo name and figures out how to make all of the HTTP calls necessary to get all the information I need about the repository and the collaborators. And I will expose that method here as part of the public API. So getRepo details points to getRepo details. And now inside of here, I will declare a variable that represents the repository, and that variable is going to contain all the information that we need to return to whoever called this method. So ultimately, return repo is going to be the goal. But first I need to populate that object with all of the information we need. And to do that, I'm going to need to call the GitHub API server. The place I want to go is https api.github.com/repos/ and then add in the username and another slash, and add in the repo name. And I also need to return a promise because all of this is going to be asynchronous. I am going to return http.get and call that repo URL, but I don't want to return the raw response. I want to add a .then here and have a function that will process that response on behalf of the controller. And it's inside of here where I say repo equals response.data. So before, when we had get user and get repos, we did some simple processing of the response just to return response.data. And ultimately, inside of a controller, when it calls .getUser.then, what the .then is waiting for is response.data. That's what we're going to return to it. But in get repo details, I want to take this one step further. I don't want to return just the repository information. I want to also go out and get collaborator information and process that and give the controller back an object that is full of information about the repository and all the collaborators are filled in too. And so instead of returning response.data, I'm going to return http.get on that repo URL again, but this time add in the slash collaborators. And that's going to return another promise from this then. The beautiful thing about promises is that you can chain them together, and we've done this already. Get user returns response.data from a then method. So a controller has to say .getUser.then to process response.data. What I'm doing is that second .then inside of get repo details so I can process this HTTP response. So again, a function that takes a response, and now I have collaborator information inside of this object. So if I say repo.collaborators equals response.data, I have now taken that collaborator information and attached it to my repository object. And ultimately what I want to do is just return repo. So chained promises can be a little bit mind-bending. We talked about this in the last module. But ultimately what I am going to return to the caller of get repo details is a promise that will either deliver an error or it's going to deliver this repo object that I've been building up. I've placed inside of that object the response to get the repository details. I've placed in that object the response that includes the collaborators details. And by placing this all inside of .then calls with return statements, I'm essentially building a bigger promise that says, I will give you a result once all of this work is done. Both of the HTTP calls will be complete, and we will have built this entire object for you. And now my next job will be to build the template for that particular route. So new file, repo.html. I know in my repo controller, I will now have access to all of that information that the GitHub service put together. So inside of repo.html, what are the things that I might want to display? Well, I might want to display repo.name inside of a header so it's really clear what we're looking at. I also said that I wanted to display the count of open issues. So give me a div tag that says issues repo.open_issues_count. And then I want to display the collaborators. So put that inside of another div. There are multiple collaborators, so perhaps an unordered list would be nice here. And I need to create a list item for each collaborator. So ng-repeat. ng-repeat, let's use the expression for each user in repo.collaborators, which I always have to pronounce funny to make sure that I spell it correctly. Inside of here, I want to display the user's name, which in the particular data structure that comes back when you get collaborators, that is the login property. So user.login, but I also want to display their gravatar, which is available. And we've done this before. I need an image whose source references www.gravatar.com/avatar/ and then the users.gravatar_ID. We could make the alt tag the user.login also. And then it might be nice to provide some links to get back to the search page. So a link to go to #main. We'll say back to search. And perhaps a link to get back to the user details. So #user/, and here I will have to say repo.owner.login. That's a particular data structure inside the repository details that will give you the name of the user. And here I could say back to repo.owner.login. So now I have links from this view to go back to other places in the application. The last thing we need to do, I think, is inside of user.html, instead of just displaying the repository name, I need a link to go to this new feature. So an anchor tag whose href is /repo/user.login/repo.name. And it will display the text repo.name. So if we've done everything correctly, I should be able to launch a preview. Let's launch it in an external window again. Do a search for Angular. Now see that I have hyperlinks that I can click to see the details of the repository. I can see the number of open issues. I can see a list of the collaborators along with their pictures. And I have links at the bottom. I can go back to the search page, or I can go back to the Angular user itself.